Hello again. Great to be back with you as we continue our quarantine story time. Hope this finds you well. Stay safe and keep social distancing. Keep everyone else safe, please. So we have David Maraniss' great book we're continuing. When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. Last time we ended, we were in Vince's senior year at the final game of his college career. This one potentially for everything, for the right to advance to the Rose Bowl. It hadn't been once during Vince's college career. It was an incredible season, but they faltered the last game. They stumbled here a couple times towards the end of the season, but this is their chance at salvaging the season. If they win this game, they could go on to the Rose Bowl to great glory. So, pick it back up. Quote, some of our better players behaved as if we had already finished the season undefeated and had received and accepted the bid to the Rose Bowl we all wanted so badly. The Georgia hot tie hurt badly, but was not ruinous. A win against NYU, their biggest rivals, could still send Fordham to Pasadena. But the Rams could not recover the spirit that had carried them through the difficult stretch from St. Mary's through Purdue. Instead, they performed even worse against their city rivals when everything depended on the outcome. The Thanksgiving Day game played in a quagmire of mud and sleet before 50,000 fans at Yankee Stadium served as NYU's bowl, a means of redemption at the end of a disappointing 4-3-1 season and revenge for the 1935 loss that had ruined their perfect record and ended their own bowl run. Fordham scored first but missed the extra point because Palau, the regular kicker, had been knocked out with a lame ankle. NYU came back on a 3-yard run by George Savarese, who thereby earned the nickname Stonecutter for being the first and only running back all year to rush for a touchdown through the 7 blocks of granite, which is what the Fordham line was called. Lombardi had hit Savarese at the 1, but could not bring him down and rode on Stonecutter's back into the end zone. The extra point ended the scoring. Fordham spent the rest of the afternoon backed up near its goal line by the thunderous punts of NYU's Howard Dunny, who won the Maddow Trophy as Most Valuable Player. As the game ended with NYU winning 7-6, the Violets' raucous cheering section turned Fordham's own chant around, shouting, "From Rose Hill to the Rose Bowl, back to Rose Hill." It's pretty good as a diss track, actually. To Lombardi and several other Rams, it appeared again that a few Fordham players had not put forth maximum effort. Quote, some of our better players were completely sour, Lombardi said. What happened? Was it overconfidence that did them in? No, there was more to it than that. A dirty little secret that would haunt the team for years. For several weeks that Depression-era season, some Fordham players had been sneaking off to New Jersey on Sundays to play for modest pay under fictitious names in a semi-pro league. Francis Calkin, then the student manager for the football team, recalled that it was, quote, common knowledge that some of those guys would scoot over someplace to play on Sunday. Dick Healy, an end on the team, remembered that, quote, several of the guys were hurt in the semi-pro game the Sunday before the NYU game. Ed Franco was hurt in that game, but they covered it up, end quote. Handy Andy Palau grimaced in pain when asked about the incident more than 6 decades later. Quote, sure, it's true, he said. Geez, it's true. 3 linemen and 1 back. Can't say who. Not Vinny. That's probably why we lost it. Yeah, Jesus. Some of the players were banged up and they were pooped, and it's a shame. A shame. I was sure pissed off when I found out about it. A chance to go to the Rose Bowl, and they screwed it up. End quotes. For the rest of his life, Lombardi was identified as one of the 7 blocks of granite. He was unarguably the least talented of the 7 blocks in 1936, and that front wall, while outstanding, had the least impressive statistics of 4 exceptional Fordham lines that could make some claim to be known as the 7 blocks. Tim Cohane, the Fordham publicist who went on to a long career in sports journalism, years later took out a pencil and sheet of paper and drew a grid of the 4 Fordham lines. The Iron Majors 1929 edition allowed no touchdowns on the ground while compiling a 7-0-2 record. In 1930, the line allowed 1 rushing touchdown late in the year while going 8-1. Sleepy Jim Crowley's 1936 line with Lombardi at right guard finished 5-1-2 with one rushing touchdown. And the 1937 team, which retained Wojie, Devil Doll, Ali Baba, and Tarzan, but lost Lombardi, Paquin, and Pierce, was perhaps the best of all, with a 7-0-1 record and no touchdowns allowed. The other three lines fell into obscurity, while the 1936 version entered the realm of football lore, a lasting symbol of fortitude and inviolability. Lombardi himself was partly responsible for this. He alone among the men of the four great Fordham front walls emerged as a large enough figure later in life to carry the legend. But this was also the work of the storytellers. Grantland Rice and Damon Runyon and their brethren glorified the 1936 line above all others, and their fraternal heir, Tim Cohane, continued the tradition. There is something to be said for the way they presented the world, looking for the romantic aspects of human nature through the playing of games, preferring it to what would come later, the cynicism of modern journalism and its life-deadening focus on money, controversy, and man's inevitable fall from grace. The problem with the storytellers was not their exaltation of myth, but their pursuit of the ideal to the exclusion of reality, allowing for the perpetuation of the fallacy of the innocent past. Was the 1936 line inviolable? Not to hubris, not to heady distraction, not to temptation in the form of a few illicit dollars to be gained playing semi-pro ball across the river only days before the most important college game of one's career. From his playing days at Fordham, Lombardi learned lessons that he carried with him into a life of football. His inner steel, he said later, was forged in those bloody college games, especially the scoreless ties with Pitt. Quote, "I can't put my finger on just what I learned playing in those scoreless games, but it was something, a certain toughness." While he discarded the sarcasm of Sleepy Jim Crowley and the dourness of Frank Leahy, he came to understand from those coaches the importance of precision blocking, fierce tackling, and the larger, quote, truths of the game, conditioning, Spartanism, defense, and violence as distinct from brutality. He also discovered what he called football's fourth dimension. Quote, "The first three dimensions are material, coaching, and schedule. The fourth is selfless teamwork and collective pride, which accumulate until they've made positive thinking and victory habitual." End quote. But the importance of Fordham in Lombardi's life was far greater than learning what it took to play a game. From the Jesuits, he acquired a larger perspective. Duty, obedience, responsibility, and the exercise of free will were the basis of a philosophy that shaped the way he looked at himself and his world. That's not to say that he was in all respects obedient to the Jesuit way. He was a typical college student, and there was a hint of his freewheeling father in him, Old Moon, the marauder of lower Manhattan. Vinny enjoyed the action, especially when he was around his roommate, Jim Lawler. They had a regular craps game going in their dorm room, playing at night after the prayers and the bed shack, a game of which the Jesuit authorities were not entirely unaware. There would be monthly raids, seemingly without consequence, other than the appropriation of the collection of dimes, which the rector declared would, quote, go to missions. And the depth with which Lombardi absorbed Jesuit teachings was not obvious from his grades. His college transcript shows him to be, at best, a slightly above average student. In later years, friends, family members, and publicists bragged that he excelled as a student. He was variously said to have been in the top 10% and to have earned Phi Beta Kappa or cum laude honors, none of which was true. His highest grades came in his freshman year when he received B's in 7 subjects plus an A in French, making the dean's list for the only time, though he was shaken by a midterm D- in trigonometry. From then on, most of his grades were C's, even in French. In his senior year, he earned C's in both of his business classes, with low B's in psychology, religion, and ethics. The highlight of his academic career was an A on the final exam in ethics, which was the school's most rigorous course, taught by Ignatius Wiley Cox, S.J., who had a reputation for never giving away an easy mark. The values and ideas that became central to Lombardi's thinking all seem to have roots in the lectures and writings of Father Cox. He was not just another Jesuit professor, but the most renowned teacher at Fordham and an important figure in American Catholic thought. Cox had his own Sunday afternoon radio program in New York, wrote articles for Liberty, America, and Commonweal, along with frequent letters to the editors at the New York Times. He had completed the seminal work of his career, a little red-covered ethics textbook entitled Liberty, Its Use and Abuse, in time for Lombardi and his classmates to study it in 1936. His course on ethics was mandatory and served as the pedagogical culmination of 4 years of scholastic theology. He lectured the entire class of senior men for 2 hours every day inside the vast bowl-shaped auditorium at the newly opened Keating Hall. Standing up there on the podium, stern and imposing, with black cassock, glasses, whitish-gray hair, and a slightly reddish face, he appeared as the embodiment of rational Jesuitism, meticulously explaining every point and enunciating each word, occasionally pausing to formally inquire of a student, "Is that clear to you, Mr. Lombardi?" When Lombardi or a classmate nervously assented, Cox pressed again, "As clear as a mountain lake in springtime?" Cox was also rather often stereotyped as a staunch conservative, but that was not entirely true. He showed a strong distaste for his Catholic colleague, Father Charles Coughlin, whose right-wing diatribes followed Cox's more thoughtful presentations on the radio. He expressed sympathies for the working man, arguing in favor of the right to strike, and supported Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his re-election campaign against Republican Alfred Landon. And he was an early outspoken critic of Germany's Adolf Hitler. Not universally true among the Jesuit professors at Fordham, some of whom held anti-Semitic views. But on many issues of the day that pitted modernism against Catholic tradition, especially questions of morality, birth control, and abortion, Cox was a fierce defender of the old way, constantly warning that excessive freedom was not man's liberation but his ruination. He found himself in a rhetorical battle with free-thinking philosophers like Bertrand Russell and proponents of contraception like Margaret Sanger, even with the American Medical Association, which he said was providing, quote, "aid and comfort to the executioners of our American civilization" by condoning birth control. While a Fortune magazine poll indicated that 2/3 of all Americans favored birth control, Cox called contraception, quote, "sexual blasphemy," and argued that it went against God's order by, quote, "frustrating a faculty from obtaining its natural end." His students, who called him Iggy, were in awe of Cox, but not always receptive to everything he said, no more than many Catholics on the issue of birth control. They seemed most taken by his arguments on liberty and responsibility, which were at the heart of his lectures, and it was in that area that he had his most profound effect on Lombardi. Every day, Lombardi heard Cox lecture on the meaning of character, quote, "an integration of habits of conduct superimposed on temperament, the will exercised on disposition, thought, emotion, and action," end quote. It was man's obligation, Cox said, to use his will, quote, "to elicit the right and good free actions and to refrain from wrong and evil actions." While man was blessed with intellect and free will, he was ennobled only when he sublimated individual desires, quote, "to join others in pursuit of common good." Cox lamented that the modern world was turning away from that notion, and, quote, "the vaunted liberty which was to make us free has eventuated in a more galling servitude to man's lower nature." Cox's lectures were a distillation of 400 years of Jesuit thought going back to Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Society of Jesus in the 16th century after abandoning the unfulfilling life of a libertine Spanish army officer. When he formed his new order, Loyola transposed many of his military beliefs into his religious work, making his Jesuits the soldiers of Christ. There is a direct line in thinking from the Jesuits to football to what would become the philosophy of Vince Lombardi. The Jesuits rejected the notion of predestination, arguing that anyone could attain a state of perfection with enough zeal. Perfection went to those who sought it most eagerly. They believed in man's liberty to choose between action and inaction, good and evil, but like the military and football coaches, they also maintained a hierarchical order in which the inferior submits willingly to the superior. This willingness to accept a rightful order required believing that the chief, God, the general, the coach, loved each member of the group with the same love. The seeming contradiction between free will and blind obedience was resolved by the Jesuits through the vision of a mystical goal. Only those with free will could surrender it freely to achieve a higher ideal. The line from Ignatius of Loyola to Vince Lombardi's life in football has two other threads. In his pursuit of perfection, Loyola paid strict attention to detail. It was said that he would rewrite letters 20 times. He concerned himself with the most trivial matters, such as engaging a cook, porter, or nurse for his order. His most famous work, which came to be known as The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, is predicated on spiritual discipline and precision. The exercises cover 4 weeks of meditations from sin and hell to divine love, perhaps the spiritual equivalent of a football training camp. Anyone attempting to follow the exercises, Loyola instructed, had to keep a daily chart of his sins, and, quote, the comparison between the rows of dots at the beginning of the exercise and the rows shortened as much as possible at a later stage shows the progress made in rooting out sinful habits and tendencies. Not unlike the grading system Lombardi later developed as a coach. Diego Lainez, Loyola's student and successor, stated that few great men had so few ideas as the founder of Jesuitism, but still fewer had been more thoroughly earnest in the realization of these ideas. That, too, had echoes of Vince Lombardi. The class of 1937 was graduated at Fordham at 4 in the afternoon of June 16th, a gorgeous summery day. The outdoor ceremony on the green quadrangle framed by a soft blue sky above the towering frontispiece of Keating Hall. The ceremonies were presided over by the Archbishop of New York, His Eminence, Patrick Cardinal Hayes. Marie Planitz was there with her sister Marge. Marie is Vince Lombardi's girlfriend. Harry and Maddie, mom and dad, for Vince, came with Madeline, Claire, Harold, and little Joe. After arriving to the processional La Reine de Saba, Vin received his Bachelor of Science degree. He was wearing his class ring, with garnet stone and ram on the side, and had on a pair of bright white shoes, oblivious of how they glistened garishly in the sober congregation of black and maroon. After leaving the grounds to the recessional Hail America, he posed one last time with the graduating football lettermen, including Handy Andy Palau, Natty Pierce, Captain Frank Mott, Big Jim Lawler, and Leo Paquin, and once more he led them in song. Once more the old maroon, wave on high, we'll sing our battle song, we do or die. It's the end of chapter 3. Advancing on to chapter 4. Saints. This was Englewood, in the clean slate sunshine of an autumn Saturday morning 2 years before the war. The town, nestled comfortably along the Hudson River in New Jersey, 4 miles west of the George Washington Bridge and the cacophony of New York, still had a radiant sheen. Its unhurried avenues looped and dipped in the Seven Sisters Hills, shimmering ridges with a red and yellow canopy of ancient elm, oak, and hickory. Crisp piles of raked leaves smoked-simmered at the curb, sweetening the air with an intoxicating incense of order and yearning. This guy won the Pulitzer Prize. That's a good sentence. The population of leaf rakers, including a superintendent of shade trees, was middle class in the most varied sense, balanced impartially between Manhattan commuters and well-settled families, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, second- and third-generation Irish, Italian, and Polish Catholics, with a growing Jewish community, and a small pocket of black citizens whose families had settled near downtown to work in the grand houses up on the hill. That is where the millionaire industrialists and Wall Street bankers had once lived, but they were mostly gone, retreated deeper into the sheltered countryside to ever more capacious homes. In the American suburban tradition, Englewood took much of its identity from its schools. The large public high school, Englewood Dwight Morrow, had a superior academic record and a campus so vast that it was often mistaken for a private college. There was also St. Cecilia, a parochial school whose reputation far exceeded its size. Everyone in town, indeed in much of North Jersey, knew St. Cecilia as Saints, its nickname. Saints, which sat fortress-like on the slope of Demarest Avenue on the north edge of downtown, was constructed from blocks of granite, with a gray Gothic cast, its courtyard shadowed by the white marble Romanesque Revival clock tower of St. Cecilia Roman Catholic Church next door. The school was coeducational and had fewer than 400 students drawn from a wide swath of Bergen County. The girls wore uniforms of blue jumpers and white blouses, the boys dressed in coats and ties. The church and school were under the administration of fathers from the Carmelite order, assisted by nuns from the Sisters of Charity, who lived in a nearby convent. The faculty included a few male teachers not in the priesthood. 2 new lay teachers arrived at Saints in the fall of 1939, classmates from Fordham University named Andrew Palau and Vincent Lombardi. Lombardi had been scuffling for 2 years before he found the little school in Englewood. We do or die? Nothing had seemed so clear as his old fight song after graduation. At first, he could not figure out what to do. Most of his classmates had assumed that he would make his way in the business world. He had dressed and acted like a corporate leader for years, but he had no interest in the one opportunity available to him, Harry, his dad's, meat shop. And the only other job he could find was making collection calls on deadbeat borrowers, a task that was neither pleasant nor well paid. He wasn't talented enough to make a full-time living in pro football, but signed on to play in the second-rung American Professional Football Association for the Brooklyn Eagles, whose home games drew decent crowds at Ebbets Field and made him a minor Brooklyn celebrity. In a sense, he was back home, bolstered by his father and the Izzos, who appeared at every game. Vince even lived at home for a time, bulking up to 205 pounds on Mattie's cooking and occasionally, reluctantly, assisted his father on the waterfront. This life inevitably began to feel suffocating, and he made one brief and futile efforts to get away, venturing down to Delaware to play for the Wilmington Clippers, another semi-pro football team. He apparently worked temporarily in a research lab for DuPont during his time in Wilmington, though the company has no personnel records establishing his employment there. In any case, he returned to New York before the fall of 1938 and enrolled at Fordham's Law School, attending classes downtown on the 28th floor of the Woolworth Building. Another dead end. Vincent T. Lombardi, Esquire, might have been his old man's dream, but he had little desire to be a lawyer and less aptitude for the law. Quote, "He got tired of it fast. It wasn't his cup of tea," said Richard Izzo, his cousin, a third-year law student at Fordham when Lombardi began there. One semester and Lombardi was out, with poor grades that he tried to conceal ever after. 2 lost years. Andy Palau was also struggling by the summer of 1939. After graduation, he had tried to make it to the big leagues as a catcher in the New York Yankees farm system, but fell short. Now he was shuttling between a semi-pro team in Vermont and his home in Connecticut, where he was pulling a shift in a Bristol factory. One night after work, Palau received a call from Nat Pierce, left guard of the 7 Blocks, who had been teaching and coaching football at a small Catholic high school in New Jersey, St. Cecilia. Sleepy Jim Crowley had just hired Pierce to return to Fordham as an assistant coach. Was Palau interested in taking over for him at St. Cecilia? So much so that the next day he rode the train down to Grand Central Station, caught a bus across the river to Englewood, and presented himself to Father Basil Collar in the St. Cecilia Rectory. He was hired on the spot, then unhired, briefly, when a nun discovered that Palau was a Lutheran. It took a phone call from Fordham's Father Tynan to set matters straight with the Mother Superior. One of Palau's first tasks was to hire an assistant coach. He tried several other Fordham classmates with no luck before placing a call of desperation to his old baseball coach, Jack Coffey. Quote, "Call Vinny Lombardi," Coffey told him. "Vinny's not doing anything. He's working for his father over on the waterfront and collecting money from poor people for some darn finance company." Lombardi? Palau had not thought of him. The last he had heard, Vin was considering the priesthood again. "No," said Coffey, "he was back in Brooklyn." Father Tynan had talked to Lombardi recently, Coffey said, and had the impression that he was searching for a new vocation. With nowhere else to turn, Palau made the call. Lombardi seized the offer. There was no master plan, just a call from Handy Andy, the Lutheran quarterback, looking for someone to help him out at a little Catholic school in New Jersey. That is how Vince Lombardi became a football coach. And that's all the time that we have for today. Pleasure spending the time with you. Again, I hope you're well. And for all of our neighbors and friends in nursing and retirement homes, we're thinking of you. In fact, that's why I'm here and doing this, because I'm thinking of you. And I don't want you to be alone. And for all of the other folks listening while sequestered in proper social distancing, keeping everyone safe, I hope you're well, too. Try not to go too bonkers. And I'll be back with you tomorrow to talk more Vince Lombardi as he embarks on his coaching career for the first time. It took a while to get there, but it's been a fun ride along the way. Maraniss is a heck of a writer. Again, to give him another plug, if you want to buy the book, definitely worth it. See if you can get it at a bookstore once quarantine lifts and whatnot, the safer at home order lifts. If not, then grab it at Amazon when pride still mattered. All right, I'll talk to you tomorrow. All the best.